We'll try this one more time. Welcome, everybody, to our Kitsap Legislative Pulse. This is a joint effort of our local chambers of commerce here. So we want to thank the Bainbridge Island Chamber, our Bremerton Chamber, Silverdale, of course, our Greater Kingston Chamber of Commerce, and our South Kitsap Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring today's event with Congressman Derek Kilmer. So we're calling this Legislative Pulse, where we sort of keep our finger on what's happening. And we're happy today to get an update from our Congressman from Washington, D.C. He was very kind to spend some time with us here in district when he was out of session. Now he's back in session, obviously in a phone booth. So we're going to turn it over to him because we had a short time with our Congressman. So Congressman Kilmer, thank you.
You bet. Thanks, Dave and David, I guess the Davids, and Irene and all the members of the chamber. Let me just start by saying something that, as a guy who worked in economic development professionally before I got to Congress, I always wanted elected officials to say to our local employers, and that's just simply thanks. Thank you for doing business in our community. Thanks for employing people. I know that this last 18 months or so has been the pits, and I'm just very grateful to each of you for demonstrating resilience and weathering some really choppy waters. I also want to thank the chamber. I know the chamber has done a terrific and aggressive job of trying to get information out to people. I think that really mattered throughout this pandemic, and I just want to say thank you for that. Probably the most important, so when the time we have together, I thought maybe I would take a minute or a couple minutes and give a little bit of rear view mirror and a little bit of windshield and talk about what we've been through and talk about what's ahead. In terms of what we've been through, probably the most important decision that I've made over the course of this pandemic was not a vote that I cast or a position I took on an issue, but a decision I made that if someone reached out to my office having lost a job or lost a business or lost a loved one because of COVID, that I'd call them. In fact, I spent my last hour talking to people who have really had the rug pulled out from under them. And I have to tell you, those conversations have absolutely informed my approach over this year and 6 months or so. It has absolutely fostered a greater sense of urgency on my part to make sure that we're providing help to folks who need it. And so, just to give you some examples, early on in the pandemic, I talked to a woman out in Port Angeles who said, she said, Derek, I've worked my entire adult life until this pandemic started. And she said, I got laid off. And she said, Derek, I used to organize the food drive for my employer. And for the first time in my life, I had to go to a food bank because I couldn't feed my family. And I have to tell you, I thought about her when Congress passed the American Rescue Plan earlier this year, because it provided resources for families like hers to make sure we're providing nutrition assistance, support to our food banks, housing assistance so that people don't lose their housing as a consequence of something that's not their fault. I talked to a restaurateur in our neck of the woods who said, he said, it's taken me 3 decades to build this business. He said, I got a lot of families who depend on me. So I'm just really struggling to figure out how to keep the lights on. And that wasn't a unique conversation. I've talked to a ton of employers who've really struggled over the course of this past year. And I thought about those conversations when Congress passed the American Rescue Plan earlier this year, because it included things like extending that Paycheck Protection Program and providing some grant-based resources for restaurants and bars and coffee shops and some particularly hard hit industries. I talked to a son a few months ago who lost his mom to COVID, and he just sobbed. It was a terrible conversation. He said, I couldn't even go see her in the hospital before she died. And, I confess, I thought about him and a lot of other families that I've talked to who've been touched by this, including a family in Kitsap County, a woman whose partner was not even able to get hospice care because we've seen such a strain on our medical system as a consequence of the rise in COVID cases. And I thought about them when Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, because it provides resources to our medical providers. And importantly, helped fund America's effort to get people vaccinated. You know, it's important to recognize that when we started this year, you know, maybe a couple million people nationwide had been vaccinated. You know, we're now at a point where there's been about, you know, I think about 380 million shots in arms, nearly 390 million shots in arms across our country. You know, and that's a pretty extraordinary feat. You know, and hopefully we'll keep people safe and make it so that none of us are having those conversations with people who are losing loved ones as a consequence of this this virus. There were other things in that bill that I could talk about. There was housing assistance. There was expansion of resources to our public schools, which was really important. As a dad of a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, I'm very happy that my kids are back in in-person school. You know, that's important for them and for their education. It's also important for all working parents to have some place for their kids to go and to learn. You know, there were resources for state and local and tribal governments who have been on the front line of this pandemic so that they could provide help to people who were struggling, to businesses that have been struggling, and make sure that we make it through this pandemic not from a position of weakness. So that was mostly the rearview mirror. Let me talk a little bit about the windshield. There's a lot going on in Congress right now. There's some stuff Congress has to do over the next couple of weeks. It has to pass a government spending bill by the end of the month to avert a government shutdown. We've seen in the past how damaging government shutdowns are. And I am fiercely opposed to shutting down the government. And hopeful that you'll see the spending bill has already passed the House. I'm hopeful that we'll see common sense prevail in the Senate. Congress has to pass an extension of the debt limit. For folks who haven't followed this closely, this is not a question of whether or not the federal government should or shouldn't spend more money. This is a simple question of, does the US government pay its debts? This is the equivalent of agreeing to pay the minimum balance on your credit card. You can make the choice not to pay it. It will wreak havoc on your credit score. And the same is true with regard to our debt limit as a country. I am someone who actually believes we have to get a handle on our nation's long-term fiscal obligations, but I also believe it's absolutely, you know, America is a country that pays its debts, and that we don't want to not pay our debts and see the extraordinary damage done to our economy by not doing that. There are a couple other things that are in the mix that you've probably read about in the newspaper or seen on TV. I am hopeful that we'll see progress in the next few weeks on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. This is pretty important. We know that according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, American infrastructure grades out at a C-. If my kids came home with that on their report card, I would be unhappy. And you all, as business people, as members of the chamber, as citizens of our region, should be unhappy with a C- infrastructure. We cannot compete in a 21st century economy with 19th and 20th century infrastructure. And so this is legislation to invest in roads and bridges, in things like wastewater and water systems, and importantly, broadband. I think one of the things that we've learned over the course of this pandemic is that access to the internet is not just about whether you can watch Only Murders in the Building on Hulu, which you should watch because it's terrific. You know, but it's also about whether you can dial into a chamber Zoom, or whether you can have a telehealth visit with your doctor, or whether you can work remotely, and which so many Americans have had to do over the course of this pandemic. Unfortunately, for too many people in our region, they can't, because they don't have adequate infrastructure, adequate broadband capacity. And that's why this infrastructure bill is so important. I'm hopeful that we will see it pass. There's also what's called the Build Back Better Act. To use the wonky expression for what that is back here, it's called the Reconciliation Package, which is basically a means through which the Senate is able to not have to deal with the filibuster. But let me talk about what this is really about. This is legislation that's about lowering costs for American families, lowering the cost of healthcare, the cost of prescription drugs, the cost of childcare, and the cost of sending a kid to college. So one, it's about lowering costs. Two, it's about lowering taxes for America's families by expanding the child tax credit, which was done under the American Rescue Plan, but only temporarily. As many of you may have followed, that provision in the tax code is expected to reduce childhood poverty in our country in half this year. That's a really big deal. Also, as part of this effort, an extension of the earned income tax credit, which as we work to encourage people to get into the workforce rather than rely on public assistance, that means that work needs to pay more than public assistance. And part of the value of the earned income tax credit is that it provides a tax incentive for being in the workforce, even in low wage work. Beyond that, the bill's focused on growing jobs. And what's gotten the most attention has been provisions related to combating the climate crisis. And those provisions are not just important from an environmental ethic, but are expected to grow between 2 and 3 million jobs in the clean energy economy and modernizing our electrical grid, and in other areas important to addressing the climate crisis. Importantly, right now in the House version of this bill, there is also a bill that I'm the lead sponsor of, a pilot version of something called the Recompete Act. The problem that I was seeking to solve with this legislation was acknowledging that we've had a lot of communities, including in Kitsap County, that have struggled for a long time. You know, if you look at a map of my district, it's basically Tacoma to the west. You know, there's a lot of communities on the Olympic Peninsula, on the Kitsap Peninsula, that have struggled economically. And I think it's important that regardless of what zip code you live in, you have economic opportunity. If you look at the challenges facing these communities, there's a few common denominators. One, a lot of these communities struggle to navigate a complex system of federal grants and loans. Most of them don't have grant writers on staff. Two, while one-off grants are helpful, it's worth recognizing that the struggles that these communities face didn't arise in 1 year, and they probably can't be solved in 1 year. So you need a more sustained approach. And three, it's important to acknowledge that different communities have different needs. A one-size-fits-all approach that you too often see from the federal government just doesn't work. If you are down in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, right now their biggest challenge is 90% of their land mass is in the floodplain. So they've really struggled to drive any sort of new economic development or housing development because no one wants to invest in a floodplain. So if they were able to get some assistance from the federal government, they'd probably use it to solve for that. You know, some of the communities I represent don't have broadband access. Some need help with workforce development. Some need to redevelop brownfields. My brother worked in a mill in Port Angeles that shut in the late 90s and is still a derelict site sitting behind a chain link fence. And so the challenges that communities face are as diverse and different in every community. And so the proposal, the bipartisan proposal that I put forward would provide some flexible, long-term 10-year grant assistance to persistently distressed communities to help them really close that gap in employment so that no matter where you live, you have an opportunity to have economic success. So that's currently part of the package too. I will mention, since what may be on some of your minds is that all sounds terrific, how are we going to pay for it? There are active discussions underway about this right now. In the entire menu of options that exists for the Build Back Better Act, thankfully there are some common themes. One, that there is a desire to protect small businesses. That's important to me. I represent a district that doesn't really have a lot of big businesses. We don't have, a lot of, Boeing's not, headquartered in our business in our district. We have mostly our Main Street employers, and making sure that the tax policies don't negatively impact them is important to me. Importantly, and this has been an ethic from the president on down, none of the proposals currently on the table would impact families making under $400,000 a year. I think that's really important as well. I think it's all right to expect that folks who have done really well in the course of this economy, even in this tough economy, that they pay their fair share. But to me, it's really important that middle-class families that I represent aren't seeing their taxes go up. So with that, let me just mention a couple things in closing, and then I'll move on to questions. Katie Crabtree is on the line from my team. We got a terrific team. Everybody's working really hard to make sure we're going the extra mile for our district. Half of our staff in the district does what we call casework. So if someone has an issue over the course of the last year, a lot with the SBA, but with the VA, with the IRS, immigration, Social Security, you name it, we go to work on their behalf. So I share that with you. We got a great team that's good at solving problems, less good at solving problems we don't know about. So I know a lot of you, and I know how active you are in the community. If you're willing to be our eyes and ears, if you talk to someone who needs a hand, please put them in touch with our office. We also have an email newsletter, and maybe I can ask Katie to put the link into the chat for our. Wow, you're really on top of it, Katie. That was quick. To sign up for our email newsletter. It's just a way to keep up with the good, the bad, and the ugly of what the heck is going on in our nation's capital. I guess the final thing I'll mention before we move on to questions. You know, our capacity to make progress on a lot of these things requires Congress just to work better than it's been working. That absolutely shapes some of my approach to this job. I co-chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a group of a dozen Democrats and a dozen Republicans who meet each week for breakfast. And, we try to figure out where there might be areas where we can work together. And even where there is disagreement, we try to make sure we're kind of understanding where folks are coming from, rather than having this place, as is too often the case, resemble the Jerry Springer show. I've also been asked to chair a new committee in Congress called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which makes us sound like we're the IT help desk. We're not. We've been nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee. This is usually where when I tell people that, they say I'm praying for you. But we are a committee that about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress realizes that things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to do something about it. And this is the recent iteration of that committee. Our mission, simply put, is to make Congress work better for the American people. And we're working hard and have had some success, and I'm happy to talk about that too. But I want to do more listening and responding to your questions and concerns and less talking at you. So why don't I stop there, and happy to talk about that committee or any of the stuff that's cooking in our nation's capital. But I'll cede the floor now and take your questions.
Thank you, Congressman. It's always good to get an update straight from DC, so we appreciate that. We appreciate obviously everything that's happening in the rearview mirror and what's coming forward in the windshield. So we're excited to hear that, and we're also very excited to hear that they're going to fix Congress for us. So good luck with that.
Working on it.
Good. So I will turn it over to folks for a question and answer. If you have anything you want to put up in chat, you can do that, or if you want to raise your hand and mute yourself, we can do that. I do have a couple of questions to start us off, and they're related to casework. And Katie will tell you very clearly, this is about my businesses and a couple of other businesses in my peer network that I know in the restaurant community. And this is rearview mirror work. This was done on the ARP, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, Congressman. I myself, my business was awarded a grant in May, which was rescinded in July. I don't know if you know what that feels like to have an award substance be offered and then pulled out after my business. I just had a conversation literally an hour ago with Jeff from the Harbor House in Bainbridge Island, and he had the exact same experience that I had with the Restaurant Relief Fund. So those funds did not materialize for our businesses that suffered greatly during COVID. So the casework of the SBA is still required on the Restaurant Relief Fund. We need to figure out if that's going to get replenished. because it's critical. You can't have those funds promised and not delivered. Devastating to my business. Related to the SBA, myself, my business, I actually had to go and apply for a disaster loan. We're at that stage. That has not been an easy process as well, and it's very reminiscent of my experience with the Restaurant Relief Fund, where the application's been submitted and it's stuck in a review status, and it has been for 2 weeks. That's a lot of time when you've been told in May that you're going to get funds, and then to have to go to a loan for disaster assistance, and then be told you got to wait 45 days for that assistance to come. Frankly, it's shocking that it would take that long in this current environment. So I apologize for making this very personal, but we need help with the SBA. We're not getting through. We're making the calls. They're telling us not to.
Has a difference of 8.
And they're anyway, we need help with the SBA very clearly. So Katie, I appreciate what you're doing on the inside, and anything more we can do to get through to them, particularly with restaurants, if we can get some priority in the processing of disaster loans, because our funds were rescinded under the RRF, we most appreciated. And then the second piece of casework that's open and still pending with small businesses like my own are the employee retention credits. My company's applied for retention credits from the third quarter of 2020 and the fourth quarter of 2020. And those amounts haven't come home again. The IRS is not providing those credits. So, the question I have is, I'm investing a lot in payroll. We did this through payroll protection. I protected the payroll. I've kept my employees on. The employee retention credits, I've retained my employees. And I'm not getting the credits back through the IRS. And this is 100% accurate in my entire peer network in the restaurant and independent restaurant community. We've applied for employee retention credits, and they simply are not materializing. So we need help with the IRS. Again, there is nobody we can call that will answer questions at the SBA or at the IRS. So we're relying on casework. And when you do call the SBA, I will say that they have a reporting message that says everything short of it will take an act of Congress to get the Restaurant Revitalization Fund replenished. We're at that stage. So Congressman Kilmer, please connect on our behalf. I would appreciate that. So I have those 2 pieces in casework that I just wanted to reiterate and thank you for providing resources that are helping us to work on that. But we have not seen substantive movement on those 2 pieces of casework. So I'll turn that over for comment. Thank you.
You bet. One, Dave, don't apologize at all for saying you're talking personally. Business is personal. And, when you're employing people who depend on you for that paycheck, that is personal. And so I completely understand, and I appreciate you and your business, and I'm grateful that you do business in our neck of the woods. You mentioned it will take an act of Congress to replenish the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. We are working to get that done. I wish I could tell you with a sense of certainty that that's going to make it across the finish line. This is something that I've been pushing to have included in the Build Back Better Act. And all of this will get worked out here over the next couple weeks, probably. And so I wish I could give you a sense of certainty. I can't right now because it's still, I can tell you what I want to have happen. I cannot tell you whether it will happen because there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of variables, including what will the size of the overall package be. And that will impact whether and how much goes into whether funding goes into and how much funding goes in to the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Beyond that, I know that you've been in touch with our team. We will continue to work with the agencies that you mentioned. This is part of what our casework team does. And to you and to others who are still grappling with whether it be the SBA or IRS, please know that we're eager to go to bat for you. And even if it takes me reaching out personally and trying to make sure you're getting answers to your questions, I'm happy to do it.
Great. Thank you very much. So going back to the other things.
I need to vote one. So give me 60 seconds. I'll be right back.
Thank you, Congressman. Great. We can talk amongst ourselves. So put out there for any of the other folks in attendance today. Are there any questions you'd like to ask the Congressman? We can wait till he comes back.
I have a question.
I have a question for him as well.
Okay, why don't we start at my screen? I see John Morrissey. You're unmuted. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, do you want me to wait till he comes back?
We can wait till he comes back. Okay.
Okay.
How about by show of hands? Are there any employers here that have applied for
I'm back.
retention credits? Has anybody applied for this? And has anybody seen retention credits materialize? Okay. All right, our Congressman is back, and we do have a question, Congressman, from John Morrissey. So thank you for your vote, Congressman.
Yeah.
We hope it went in our favor.
Yeah.
That's a
Indeed.
quick vote. You're efficient there, Congressman. Say, I just have some hope that you could shed some light on an area that may not be as applicable to everyone on this call, but it does to me and those I work with. And that's some of the information around the changes to financial institutions reporting as part of the infrastructure bill, and the $600 rule there, and kind of just shed some light on that for us so that we can better understand what we're working with and how we should proceed. I know we're working with the Northwest Credit Union Association, et cetera.
Yeah. John, I appreciate your outreach on this, and know that we've heard from others in the Credit Union Association. I think, frankly, this is still a little bit of a moving target. I think we may see changes in this before something makes it across the finish line, in part because of some of the concerns raised by folks in your industry. I think there's the problem that they're trying to solve for is to have adequate enforcement by the Internal Revenue Service. What I think is important, and I think all of us would agree that it's legitimate to expect folks to pay what they owe. What I think the federal government needs to be conscious of is not creating such an extraordinary regulatory burden for community-based lenders that it ends up being a drag on our economy, or creating problems with regard to access to credit. So we will see how this needle gets threaded. I'm not sure if that's the proper verb, but we will see that over the course of the next few weeks here.
Okay, yeah, I think ours is more, we don't want to erode the trust that we have, that somebody's going to pull their money out, and that does create some lending issues down the line. So yeah, we'll stay tuned as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And it looks like we have another question coming in. Catherine Arndt from Serpro. She's also on leadership Kitsap. Catherine, did you have a question that you wanted to?
Yes, I have two questions. So Serpro is located over by Gorse, right on the corner of Gorse. I was wondering if you had an update on the Gorse Coalition, and if I've seen the different blueprints, so to speak, the maps of how it's going to be, if we had any updates. I know for our company, we're on hold. We would like to expand and do some upgrades to our building, but we are on hold because we don't know how that plan will look and how it will affect our front of our property line. And then my second question is regard to if there's any updates on the Long-Term Healthcare Act. I did see some things going around for appeal process, and I haven't seen any new updates on that, so to speak. So I was wondering if you had any info on that.
I can't speak much to the second question, only because that's state legislation, not federal. So I know that there have been questions. We've gotten some questions from constituents about that. I think those are probably best answered by your state legislators, who are kind of closer to the issue. On the Gorst effort, let me just start with acknowledging why this has been an effort that we've been a part of, and why I think it's important to address some of the challenges at Gorst. Anybody who has traveled through Gorst and sat in traffic knows that the speed limit signs through there are only there for nostalgic purposes at this point. This is something important to every worker who has been stuck in traffic, to every senior who's been late to a medical appointment. It's important to jobs in Kitsap County. We have that very large industrially zoned property up at the Port of Bremerton. that depends on fixing some of this problem at Gorse to actualize the amount of jobs that there are zoned for up there. It's also important to our county's largest employer, the Navy. There's a reason the Navy's been part of this coalition, and that's because if you read the last Base Realignment and Closure Commission report, this is one of the areas that we got dinged. And it wasn't the traffic, it was the lack of resiliency. God forbid there's a earthquake or a tsunami or something like that. We're really cooked because, you know, we have the only West Coast shipyard capable of maintaining carriers, and that is the main route in. And so I think it's really important that we address the problems at Gorst, and this has been a conversation for eons. And part of the reason that I was involved in standing up this coalition was to say, hey, let's stop talking about it. Let's do something about it. One of the early decisions made by the coalition was that if we're going to do this, you know, there was a corridor study done a few years back, and it basically laid out a short-term, mid-term, and a long-term fix. And the assessment by everybody was, we should think about making the long-term the short-term, because the reality is just sticking duct tape over this thing isn't going to really fix our problem. And it most assuredly doesn't fix the resiliency issues that are of concern to the Navy. So what's the federal government's role in this? Well, one, as part of the Invest in America Act that passed out of the House, we were able to secure a little bit more than $8 million for pre-engineering and pre-design work to kind of get the ball rolling. On top of that, there's substantial funding for modernizing our roads. In that instance, it's money that would go to the state of Washington for projects of state significance, and this is one of those that would likely secure substantial funds should an infrastructure bill pass. Now, having said all of that, part of the rationale behind the Gorse Coalition is a recognition that when projects like this happen, they have to happen with the community that's impacted, not to the community that's impacted. That we need to make sure that businesses in the area have a voice in the process, so that there's a consciousness about the impact to local employers. That and you know, and that's not just true of employers. For that matter, you know, the Native American tribes in our area are concerned about potential impact to treaty reserved rights and impact to the fisheries. So, you know, it is important that our community has a voice in this process. It's part of the value of a community coalition working on this, so that we can have everybody inside the boat, you know, hopefully getting to a point where we can all row in the same direction. And I think that's important if we're going to see something happen on this. I think it is vitally important, not just to the Navy, but to Kitsap County's future, that we see this investment happen, and we're continuing to work toward that end.
Thank you, Congressman. Okay, looking around, I don't see any other hands raised. Do we have, this is a good opportunity for us to ask any questions that might be remaining. Let's see any other hands raised up there.
I should also acknowledge, because I hadn't flipped through all who's on, Chuck Moe and his team at the Laborers have been really important members of that Gorse Coalition. I can't say enough good about their involvement in this, because it's, you know, what's important with a project of this significance is that it can put people to work now, which is really important. And importantly, it can lay the foundation for economic growth over the long haul. So this is a real twofer. I mean, it's like a fourfer, but I'm not sure that's a word. But anyhow, Chuck, good to see you on my screen, and grateful for your involvement. I'm doing this from my cell phone from a phone booth, so I haven't been able to flip through to see who all was on. So just saw you, Chuck.
Great. Well, it looks like we have no other questions for our Congressman. So we're going to wrap up now and say thank you, Congressman Kilmer, for your time today and for fielding our questions. Oh, do we have a question? Chuck. Okay. I guess we do have a question from Chuck, and then we'll wrap up.
Not so much a question. I just wanted to follow up. I was kind of waiting until things wrapped up, make sure everybody had the time to ask their questions on the floor. One, I appreciate the ability to be a member of the Silverdale Chamber of Commerce. I deal with quite a few different communities, and the Silverdale Chamber of Commerce is an active partner in our community, as is Congressman Kilmer. With Labor's Local 252, we're blessed to represent pretty much all of his jurisdiction. And it's amazing how often I do run into Congressman Kilmer in meetings like this. He is a true part of the community. He truly does care about the people that live and work in his communities, and it shows. And I have had the pleasure to work with him on several things, including the Gorst Coalition. So just thanks for coming here tonight. Thanks for being part of the Silverdale Chamber of Commerce. And I do enjoy working with not only yourself, Congressman, but this chamber. Some very good people here, some very good business owners in our community and business leaders.
Thank you.
Oh, Chuck, that's great. Thanks. And that's actually a really good way for us to wrap. I'm going to go ahead and thank our sponsorship chambers again. Obviously, Silverdale Chamber of Commerce for being a host here. David, thank you very much for the work you do here. Bremerton, Kingston, Paulsbo, and South Kitsap chambers. Thank you for participating, and thanks for your comments. We'll give you back the rest of your day. Up next for Legislative Pulse, we are tracking at government affairs in both Silverdale and South Kitsap. Redistricting. So some of that information is just coming out about what we're doing with our new legislative districts. So keep your eye on your email inbox and your spam folder, because sometimes our Chamber of Commerce messages do go into the spam folder, so yank them out of there and take a look at them. But we will have some information coming about these new proposed district maps that are coming out. A lot of Kitsap County and Pierce and some of the stuff is in play. Vashon Island, some of the proposals are pretty interesting when it looks to changing the way that we elect our representative officials. So get engaged and get involved with that if you can. And follow that. Look for the newsletters. David Emmons will be sending out some information on redistricting.
Actually, the redistricting, Irene and I will have it in the Monday morning memo in your inboxes by 8 o'clock every Monday morning. So it's great information.
So on behalf of all the chambers involved, we would like to thank Katie Crabtree. Thanks for coming in, and of course, Congressman Kilmer. So
You bet. Next time I
you.
promise I won't be in a phone booth.
Actually, I think it's amazing that you are in a phone booth, taking your time out of voting with us and sharing this.
Let's see if there's a Superman logo underneath there.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, yes. Yeah, Dave.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.